Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. We do educational videos on this channel, and we gear it toward great theories of everything, help you out with your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better spiritual and mental and physical health. And we usually look at cosmologies and grand unified theories, all-encompassing theories, also tour de forces and magnum opuses and earth-shattering discoveries. And most of them come from obscure sources. A lot of difficult material, and we try to, help you out with, a few editorial words of guidance from somebody who's probably, I've already looked at these, and so sometimes these things aren't, always the most accessible. Not only because of the subject matter, but also because the subject matter is new and unfamiliar. And so a lot of times the author might leave out a key piece of information, or might say something in a way that maybe could be rephrased or whatever. So I'm just trying to guide you through this with a friendly voice, because I know that some of these things can be intimidating. And today is our 224th video that we've done on the unit that is called the Reciprocal Church, which is named for the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey B. Larson. Mr. Larson put together I believe, the most complete and really simplified all-encompassing theory of everything, unified theory that unifies all the sciences and religion as well. And he delved into many, many different subjects, and I've tried to cover a lot of those in previous videos. I've done about almost 600 videos on the reciprocal system of theory, so please check that out. But we're just using his term for the Reciprocal Church, where we will be using his work as well, but we're trying to assemble spiritual resources that you can use in your own life to accentuate your experience of the divine and facilitate your experience of the divine. And but also things that you can trust, you can believe in, because they check out. And there's evidence for them. There's sometimes even equations for them. Unlike the current religious environment, where we have an Old and New Testament that are basically full of fraud and psyops, psychological operations, and using God with a small g to replace God with a capital G. And we've been looking at the New Testament here for the last couple months, and showing all the ways that we're attempting to decode the New Testament, but we're kind of laying the groundwork for all that. And today we're going to continue looking at the work of Michael Menescot's Christianity's Origin, Flavian Secrecy Cult. And like many, many other authors, Menescot's, who just put this book out like 3 months ago, he ascribes to the thesis that the Romans created the New Testament. The Roman Caesars, in particular the Flavian dynasty, from 69 to 96 AD, including Emperor Vespasian, Emperor Titus, and Emperor Domitian, and that some combination of them and or their royal court wrote up the New Testament. And also that a character named Josephus was definitely in on it, who was in the royal court at this time. And whether or not Josephus was a real person is a debate that some of these scholars have. He doesn't believe so, and I don't either. But we have different takes on who actually wrote the New Testament. But I think the main point, though, is, and what I wish he would kind of emphasize, is that his evidence here that he's deploying is really some stellar proof that the Romans wrote the New Testament. Whoever was Josephus wrote the New Testament, because the New Testament and Josephus's works, particularly his War of the Jews or Jewish War, mirror or really parallel the New Testament in so many different places that it's inconceivable that they were written by different sources. And they don't, there's a reciprocity there, to use the reciprocal word again, in that they parody each other. So it's not just like Josephus is parodying the Gospels. Then you could say that one was written before the other. But they parody each other back and forth. And so they're interactive or intertextual. And he has a more involved theory that this is a Roman secrecy cult, and that you get indoctrinated in stages. First, you learn to worship Jesus. Then you recognize that, first you see Jesus as a prophet. Then you learn to worship Jesus. And then you recognize that Jesus is predicting his second coming, and his second coming is Titus, Emperor Titus. And so that shifts you over to recognize that, oh, Jesus is secondary, Titus is the main deity. And then eventually you get rid of the Jesus part entirely, and you become what he calls a pure Flavian worshiper. I don't think it's really that involved. I think that this is more a piece of wartime propaganda against the Jews in particular, but really all of the commoners in general. It's a form of social control to propose a character to worship who is a prince of peace, who believes in turning the other cheek, who believes in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, which is basically paying your taxes, who believes in walking an extra mile with the Roman soldier's backpack on his back, which was a law for the Jews at that time, and to walk 1 mile, but he offered to walk an extra mile, and to really, at least implicitly condone slavery, and cite that a Roman centurion has greater faith than all of Israel, and so on. Then the New Testament is very much pro-Roman and very much anti-Jew. And, where he's turning over the money the tables of the money changers, you have to remember that the money changers are Jews, not Romans. And so everything that Jesus does in terms of rebellion is against the Jews, not against the Romans. And even, the Pilate, he had to be really roped into crucifying Jesus by the Jews. He wanted to, exonerate Jesus. I see that this man is innocent, or whatever he says. But the Jews clamored for him, and he offered to pardon one person for Passover, which is unlikely story, but the Jews insisted that he pardon somebody else. So anyway, we are about to start a section here that's called The Idea That the Surviving Copy of Jewish War was Titus's Second Version. Okay, so he just went through here last time, indicating that he thinks that the Jewish War by Josephus is really 7 books. They're not really long books, 7 100-page books approximately. And he's kind of saying that he thinks that the first 2 books were written at a later period than the rest of it, because the rest of it actually talks about the Jewish War, whereas the first 2 books really kind of set the table, and they go all the way back to 150 BC or something like that, when the Jewish War occurs in 66 AD. What he does that he hasn't really delved into a whole lot yet, which I think is the strongest points that he makes, is that he actually graphs out the correspondences between the book of Luke and Wars of the Jews. And in just the book of Luke, there are over 250 parallels. That's like 10 per chapter, over 10 per chapter. And when you plot all the points with the book of Luke on the vertical axis and the Wars of the Jews on the horizontal axis, they convey a message, which is APTVS. And I think that stands for Arius Piso Titus Vespasianus, but he thinks otherwise, slightly different interpretation. But like I said, I don't think that part is important. The fact that it creates letters at all, and that it's not just a totally random pattern, that they actually that they prepared it that way. They signed their name to it, the Romans. If you read War of the Jews by Josephus and the book of Luke at the same time, then plot the points, you will get the signature of who was in charge of it. So regardless of who that is, it was definitely coming from the Romans. Okay, so he's going to get into his thesis that the first half of War of the Jews, the AP part of the APTVS, or possibly even the APT part of the APTVS, was added later, and that the original version just had the VS or possibly the TVS. Okay, Jewish War begins with an introduction stating that it is a translation of an earlier version written in the paternal tongue. This is at odds with modern analyses by linguistic experts who agree that this is simply false. Again, not giving us a footnote for that. The surviving version simply shows none of the telltale signs of being a translation. So how can we explain this contradiction and all these observations about the 2 halves being so different? My answer is that the early version wasn't really in the father's tongue, the comment to that effect being a joke, because instead the earlier version was the version of the fathers, meaning Vespasian, Titus's father, Emperor Vespasian, whilst the surviving version is that of his son Titus. Okay, it's in the father's tongue. That's pretty interesting. I could definitely believe that. I'm not going to, but I'm going to at least hear it out. It's not utterly convincing, but it is quite plausible. I propose that the original version of Jewish War was about half the length and was rather similar to the second half of the surviving version, albeit that it probably emphasized Vespasian's role more. The image that would have been presented when the parallels with Luke were plotted would have instead been Vespasian's signifier, simply VS. I propose Vespasianus, I believe is what that is. I propose that the surviving version was created after Vespasian's premature death in AD 79, Anno Domini 79, and during Titus's reign. Titus only held the throne for 2 years before his own unexpected death, which may have come at the hands of his brother Domitian, although different sources say different things about that, which tallies with the semblance of the changes probably being a rushed effort. Well, if he knew he was going to die, it might have been a rushed effort, but otherwise that's not convincing. Okay, by adding 3 or so paragraphs to the front describing the previous century of conflict, this enables the addition of 3 more letters. I'm sorry, 300 or so paragraphs. On the horizontal axis, Wars of the Jews you count it by paragraphs, or he counted it by paragraphs, though you don't have to do that. You could count it in other ways too, and it would pretty much end up as the same pattern. But by adding 300 or so paragraphs out of the total of 700 to the front describing the previous century of conflict, this enabled the addition of 3 more letters, APT, which were chosen partly so that it now includes Titus' signifier TVS. Okay, so now he's explaining the TVS, Titus Vespasianus, which I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe that I have actually seen a Roman coin that has the imprint TVS on it, dated from 80 or 81 AD. And so that is, shows that the TVS part isn't just something that's made up. It's something that is, part of their method. That's part of how they sign their names. Okay, switching pages, I gotta make sure I'm at the right page here. Okay, he shows a graph and just, it's pretty much, the main graph is on the thumbnail, and he kind of, spotlights different graphs, but they're all kind of conveying the same information as the main graph. Okay, this would explain why the first half of Jewish War largely lacks parallels where Luke parodies Jewish War, and why the first 3 letters are thinner and their parallels are generally weaker, mostly lacking riddles and stellar examples. But most importantly, this explains why Jesus is linked to Titus in most of the parallels, but occasionally Jesus is linked with Vespasian instead. This would be because most of the key events in the original version of Jewish War were probably ascribed to Vespasian, perhaps with Titus as more of a sidekick. After Vespasian's death, there was a hasty effort to rewrite Jewish War so that Titus would be presented as parallel with Jesus, in order that Titus could be presented as the second coming of Jesus. Okay, now, so where does the AP come from? That said, I don't think the remaining parallels between Jesus and Vespasian are oversights. An example where editing it would have been difficult was with the events at Gerizim, which I'll discuss later. And that's a mountain. I think that's in Samaria in the north. The story at Gerizim, or however you pronounce it, Gerizim, only describes Vespasian, since Titus had not yet traveled to Judea to join his father's war effort. This parallel was left as is, with Vespasian presented as parallel to Jesus at Jacob's Well, which is under Mount Gerizim, because there wasn't really another sensible approach. I think Titus simply decided he was content to be worshipped as part of a divine duo with his Father, mirroring Jesus and his Father in the Gospels. And I think that's very plausible, because Titus went out of his way after Vespasian died. He went out of his way to have Vespasian deified by the Roman Senate, which was a thing that they did with a few of the Caesars. As a few of the Caesars were deified, they were officially by law declared to be gods. And so if he did that for his father, I would think that it would be logical that he would be able to be accepted as part of a divine duo, the Father and the Son, mirroring Jesus and his Father in the Gospels. And as I shall explain later, it was Titus's brother, Domitian, who later decided he wanted to be seen as a divine trio with them, leaving us the modern idea of a trinity. Or, I would say, it could have been Arius Piso who did the same thing. He was a family member, not a brother, kind of like a cousin, but he was kind of behind the scenes, and he was seen at least by Roman Piso, as being really the shadow emperor during Vespasian and Titus's rule. And when when Titus died and Domitian became the new Caesar, he banished Arius Piso to Pannonia. So he basically banished him from Rome because according to Roman Piso, that because Domitian was not down with the Christian psyop. And so they plotted his assassination, and when they achieved, finally, after 15 years, they finally assassinated Domitian after he executed several so-called Roman Christians from his own family. When they finally assassinated Domitian, then the road was empty. The road was open again for them to start with the Christianity. And that's when, first Emperor Nerva came in for 2 years, but he was old and he was pretty much shadowed by Piso. And then Trajan came in 98, and he was close to both Arius Piso and Pliny the Younger, who I think, if you look at Pliny the Younger's work, you can see that he was Paul. And so Pliny was the guy who wrote the epistles of Paul. Now, Michael Menescotts would very strongly disagree with that, I believe. He believes that the epistles of Paul were actually legitimate and written at the time that scholars say they were, which was in the 50s and maybe the early 60s. And but I believe that the only evidence for that is that Paul had the so-called was the only person to have the opportunity, or had the opportunity to cite the Gospels, but didn't do so because he was writing before the Gospels. And so that's the thinking there. But I think if you look at the work of Joseph Atwill, you also look at some of the work of Voskelin and Sheldon. They, show the heavy Roman origin of the Pauline epistles, and Roman Piso in particular connects the Pauline epistles with Pliny the Younger. And Pliny was not a good dude. Either was Arius Piso, but especially Pliny. Pliny eventually got banished for molesting a little boy, and he had a number of sodomite slaves, sex slaves. I'm not saying that he's the only one, but before you read the works of Pliny and think that he's a brilliant philosopher or whatever, I really doubt it. Okay, seeing that Titus didn't want to entirely rip up the narrative in Jewish war, this suggests that at a very high level, the sequence battles described in Jewish war are largely factual, even if, as I will later show, the minutiae are often fictional in order to parody the Gospel of Luke back. Makes sense. Of course, we could raise the same questions about the Gospel of Luke. Did Titus issue it as a rewrite? And does that mean that there is, in fact, a non-surviving Q document? I don't know the answer to this, but my observation is that Vespasian had probably published the story widely, and also Titus didn't need to have it rewritten because it doesn't mention Vespasian. The idea of a Q document preceding Luke makes sense if you think the synoptics were actually written by honest believers. But the case for a Q document is rather weakened by realizing that the people behind these Gospels were a team of Roman propagandists who had no intention of being honest and were trying to organize the parallels differently in Luke and Matthew so that only with Luke they would form the APTVS pattern. Has he tried? I wonder if he's tried the patterns in the other books, Matthew and Mark, or even John, or any of even the epistles later on. If you are wondering why I don't mention Mark often, it's because it may have been written after Luke, probably for the benefit of Roman soldiers. Now, Arius Piso says that is more about Pliny, or Pliny, whatever his name is, because I know he went as Linus when he was I believe he was the second pope as well. But he says that it was more Paul's epistles that were targeted at the Roman soldiers and other Gentiles. But he also says that the Q gospel came about because it originated much earlier, because the Emperor Tiberius, way back in the 30s, had put together this committee to create a new Roman religion. And there were people like Lucan and Seneca the Younger, and the two Piso brothers, Gaius and Lucius Piso. They were all in this committee to form a new, and they had a little campus where they working on it with they had all these documents, ancient documents, and they tried to put together like all the different myths and, you know, even the astrological formations and, you know, everything that they could put in about the Jews and stuff. And they prepared something. By the time they had put it together, Nero was the emperor, and he rejected it. And so they tried to assassinate Nero and failed. They were found out. And so Nero had most of them executed, including his old tutor Cicero the Younger, and Lucan, and one of the Piso brothers, who was the father of Arius Piso. So there's a lot more detail there in, now I'm not saying that that's right, but it fits in right there. So he's saying that that was the Q document, the original that they presented to Nero. And then after the war, the Jews happened, they altered the Q document in 3 different ways to make Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Okay, so having acknowledged that the original version of Jewish War might have aimed to present a VS signature, the key point remains that the story in the second half of Jewish War and the story in the Gospel of Luke can be shown to parody each other in detailed, well-hidden, and very calculated and intentional manner, such that it could be later shown that they must have been written together as a joint literary effort. I think that is the most important part of this work here, is that he shows this. Some of his other theses that he, you know, talks about, I think aren't as important. It's just that they were written together, and you can show all the parallels each other. And so one of his footnotes says, many scholars observing that Luke, Mark, and Matthew have a great deal and nearly identical texts, yet in different orders, with each own unique material, suggest best is explained by there was a Q document. So the less comfortable explanation is that all 3 were created by the same propaganda team, with Luke written for the senior ranks. That's interesting. Okay, I think that we're going to stop right there, and we will take over tomorrow at the spot. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a great day.